It's great, as I said, to see so many people interested in tonight's talk about African American history in Pasadena. Brian Biery, I'm pleased to introduce him. He will be leading tonight's presentation, and he's been working in the community for over 20 years on neighborhood engagement and social issues. I know Brian from Pasadena Neighborhood Network, where we talk about many different topics that are of interest to the community. Before we start, I wanted to let you also know if you have questions or comments at the end of Brian's presentation, please put them in the chat. And if you've not used Zoom before, if you look to the bottom of your screen, you'll see where it says participants, chat, share a screen, reactions. So you would just click on chat, and then you have the option where it says everyone, and you can just go ahead and write in your question or your comment, and then Josh will read them and Brian will answer them. Also, Josh is waving his hand so you can see. Also, Brian said he's going to be asking some, are they like just little questions along the way, and feel free to respond again in the chat to answer his questions. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Brian. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you, Mindy and Josh, for inviting me in the Washington Square Neighborhood Association. My name is Brian Biery. I'm an adjunct professor at Pacific Oaks College. And what I do with all my students is I want to go through a couple of agreements. So we all come to this with an open mind, an open heart. We're respectful, we're thoughtful, we're open to new information. So I'm looking forward to having eventually a conversation with you about this information. Something else I'd like to say is that this has been a process, and it's evolving all the time. As I continue to do more research, I'm finding more stories, and if you saw the presentation a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if anybody did with the Bungalow Heaven Neighborhood Association, it has changed since then. And that doesn't mean that history has changed, but that means that this is an evolution, and there's growth and development, and there's a lot of new stories that I'm uncovering in my research. And I want to thank also, I've got a couple people from the community who are helping me tonight, and Danny Parker, Chip Williams, and Alma Stokes. So they'll be providing some personal stories of some of the topics that I discuss. So, and I want to thank all of you. It's a Friday night. You could be doing 1,000 other things. There are, in a city like this, there's always something going on. So thank you for being here tonight and for your time and attention. And I would just want to take a moment to recognize the challenges we're in. This is a time, at least in my life, I can't remember anything that's been as complicated as the last 6 months. And one of the areas is, of course, racial reconciliation, race relations, discrimination, racism, white superiority, white fragility, and all of the other related concepts. But I've never seen, and there are people here who have a lot of experience, but I've never seen such a complex web of issues hit us all at one time. So I want to take a moment and just sit with that and say that it's been very difficult for all of us. And one of the examples of that is that we are on Zoom. We are not sitting in a school auditorium or a neighborhood living room. We are communicating through the internet. So with that being said, what I'd like to do, I'm gonna, as Mindy said, I'm gonna do a couple of, trivia questions throughout the evening, and I ran out of all my prizes, so I'm sorry I'm not gonna be able to, I gave away the Volvo last time, and the trip to Hawaii is out of the question because we can't fly anyway. So you'll just have to accept enlightenment and illumination as prizes. as opposed to anything materialistic or tangible. So with that, let's get into our material. So I'm gonna share a screen. I'm gonna walk us through a PowerPoint, and then I'm going to have Danny, Chip, and Alma join us when they're ready. So, Washington Square Neighborhood Association, thank you. This is African American History presentation. This photograph is obviously Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King at Friendship Baptist Church. He came to Pasadena 3 times during his career, one in 1958, and he spoke at Caltech. The other 2 times in 1963, and this is 1965, and he's shaking the hand of pastor of Friendship Baptist Church at that time. The other 2 times he came and he spoke at Friendship Baptist Church. When he was here, he likened the challenges of the African American community here in Los Angeles or Southern California with that of the rest of the country. So in a real sense, the Negro cannot be free in Pasadena or Los Angeles until the Negro is free in Jackson, Mississippi, Montgomery, Alabama, and all are involved in the single struggle. July 12th, 1965, Friendship Baptist Church. So we can see that we're all interconnected. So why are we here today? Since the murder of George Floyd back in May, there's been an extraordinary amount of activism, social justice activity. And sometimes we think of Pasadena as being exceptional. We think of Pasadena as being unique. We think of Pasadena as being different. In many ways, it's not. It is a microcosm, I would say, I would propose, of the entire country. We have all of the issues here, everything from immigration to healthcare to public education to housing affordability to race relations. I could go on and on and on. We have all of the themes of a society that need to be addressed, and we're wrestling with them here. So first trivia question, and just type it in the chat. Who is the speaker in this photograph? Again, this is an example of the activism that's here in the community. And this was an amazing day. I thought it was extraordinary. There were probably close to 1,000 people who came to City Hall. And there are other activities that have gone on during our the last 3 or 4 or 5 months, and plenty of protests. One of the questions that I ask is, what is the change that we want to see in our community? What is it? What would we like to alter? What would we like to improve? So these are just some organizing questions that I want to lay out to everyone and have you ponder. So who are our people? Who do we consider to be members of our community, the broader community? What is the change that they seek? And again, it could be anything from public education to immigration reform, to police community relations, to affordable housing, to employment, to healthcare, wages that are fair and just. Why haven't those issues been addressed before? What would the world look like if the problem were solved, and what would it take to solve the problem? I come from a background of being a neighborhood and community organizer, and these are the fundamental questions that we utilize to try to create social justice action or social justice improvement. And again, this photograph was taken the same time as the other one at City Hall, and it was a George Floyd vigil. How does studying history help us to create an equitable and just community? Why is it important for us to know our history? you know, historians, or quite often people, you know, fall to the side that says, well, if we don't learn it, we just keep repeating it. There's also this whole notion of the burying of history. One of the main reasons why we're doing this is because a lot of people either don't know, aren't aware of, or haven't studied local history. Oftentimes when I talk to students or even members of the community, they say, well, why didn't we learn this in school? And why is this now just coming to our attention? Well, it doesn't mean that it wasn't true. It just means that it hadn't been shared before. So it's extremely important that we know our history. This photograph is from the caravan that happened a couple of weeks after the George Floyd vigil. And this is on Raymond Avenue, just above Washington, near Washington School. So what we're gonna do tonight, we're gonna talk about the early history of the African-American community. We'll talk about a thriving community, and then seeds of discontent and how those started, and then where we are today. Second quick quiz question, and apparently because I'm sharing the screen, I can't see the answers, so maybe either Mindy or Josh will have to feed them to me. So second question is, what was the year that Pasadena was incorporated? And it's tragic that I can't see it, but oh, there it is. Maybe I can if no, I don't know.
So, Brian, for the first question, who's the person speaking? Number of people put down Jasmine.
Yes, the first one is Jasmine Richards, and I have to figure out how to close that now. Maybe that's not going to work. I apologize.
And for about the incorporation of Pasadena, Daryl Quall said 1886, and Mindy Pfeiffer said 1885.
Okay. The first question, so again, enlightenment and spiritual growth and development, or spiritual contentedness to the answer. It is Jasmine Richards. She is in charge of, or a part of, Black Lives Matter Pasadena, and she had a profound commentary that day in front of City Hall. The city was incorporated in 1886. And so just a quick overview. Why am I giving this presentation? A couple of years ago, 2018, the Garfield Heights Neighborhood Association was having problems, or observing that not all their neighbors were getting along, and part of the issue was gentrification. Many of you have heard that word here in Pasadena before. And so essentially what was happening, or what is still happening, and it's going on throughout the city, is that new neighbors are moving in, paying an extremely high price, and older neighbors are either dying off, or they're having to move because they can't afford it here. So there's a huge transformation in demographics in neighborhoods in Pasadena, particularly in the north part of the city. What Garfield Heights wanted to do was to try to build a bridge between new neighbors and neighbors who had lived in the neighborhood for many years, and to create a community where everyone is treated equally with respect. So they asked me to help with that process. What we ended up doing was we created a bus tour. If COVID-19 didn't exist right now, there's a good chance we would be on a bus, and we would go to each of these sites and talk to the people at the sites. What I've done in the interim, when Bungalow Heaven Neighborhood Association contacted me, they said that we can't do a bus tour, but let's do a virtual presentation. I said, sure, let me figure it out, and this is the result. We're gonna go to the same places, but we're going to do it through the internet. And this is a photograph of me at Blair High School. I grew up here. My mother did, my dad did. My dad's side, the family came here at around 1921. We're thinking about celebrating the anniversary next year if COVID-19 goes away, which it won't. And then on my mom's side, she was telling me recently that her grandfather or her great-grandfather came to Pasadena and lived in Pasadena in 1887, which was news to me. So anyway, this is really important to me. All right, early Pasadena history and the beginnings of the African-American community in Pasadena. So how did that start? Oh, and one really important item is that when we think of racism, again, quite often we thought of it, oh, that's a Southern issue. That's people in the South wanting to maintain slavery and dominance. But it's culturally, it's all over the country. So this is an example I just wanted to start off with. This is an orange packing house in 1886 in Pasadena, and that is the year that Pasadena was incorporated. So kudos to those who got that right. If you look in the top middle of the photograph, it says no Chinese employed. So essentially what that meant was, and this is Frank Heidenreich's orange packing house, because this was the citrus center of the country at that time. And so they needed to ship it all over the country. So they were packing oranges. They needed people to do that. But Chinese workers who picked oranges in the field were not allowed in the center of the city where the packing house was. And so immediately we see right from the very beginning of Pasadena, there are discriminatory practices in place. So how do we get here? One part of this process that really is important is that after the Civil War, there were Jim Crow laws that were put in place. I'm not going to go into detail about those. Many of you are very familiar with them and what they purported to do and what ended up happening. The point here is that there was a mass migration out of the South into the North. And it was so dramatic that at the end of the 19th century, about 85% of African Americans lived in the southern states. By 1970, it had dropped to only 40%. So 60% of African Americans live in the northern states as of 1970. That's an enormous, there were over 6 million people who moved during those years. And many of them came to Los Angeles, and some of those came to Pasadena. So here's an example. Carrie McAdoo and her husband, Booker, moved to Pasadena in 1899 from Arkansas. One of the reasons Carrie stated why they moved out here was for a better health and better weather. They were an extremely, I would say, productive and highly successful family. What Carrie ended up doing is she started her own grocery store. And for those of you who are familiar with Huntington Hospital, it was on Fair Oaks, right about the area where Huntington is located. So that's on below California Boulevard. This is the exterior of the store. This is the interior of the store. She kept the store for over a dozen years. She became one of the more successful business people in Pasadena and had a wonderful career. What I find interesting about this particular photograph is the boy, the young man or the child who's in the photograph. And then in the background, you see someone who is actually covering their face. And so I have a lot of questions, but unfortunately, this was over 100 years ago, and I can't ask Carrie what was going on there. But this is the interior of her store. The point is that Pasadena had a thriving Black community, African-American community. And for those of you, many of you on the call already know this and you're aware of it. But for those who, this is something new, this is a map that was developed in 1935 by the Planning Commission for the city of Pasadena. the Planning Commission did a demographic survey or analysis of Pasadena. Each one of those dots represents 10 people. So we see there's a large concentration of folks. So the horizontal yellow line in the middle is Colorado Boulevard. The vertical yellow line is Orange Grove Boulevard, which then curves to the right and is parallel to Colorado. We see that just below Colorado Boulevard, so the street below it, of course, is Green Street. And the kind of the key area is Pasadena Avenue to Dayton, DeLacy, Green, and then over to a street that we're going to be talking about later called Vernon Avenue. There was a dynamic and successful African-American community in that area, which again, a lot of people gloss over because now if you go down there, there's Buca de Beppo, of course, right? And the Green Street Tavern, but there are the only sign, a couple of signs that there was an African-American community is Friendship Baptist Church, which we'll talk about, and then the Francisca building, which we'll talk about as well. So there was a thriving community, it was growing. As the Great Migration continued its evolution, more and more families came to Pasadena, and friends of people who were here or relatives of people who were here would offer them space to live as well. So the Francisca building is Dayton, so it's right near Fair Oaks. And for those of you who are familiar with the fire station on Fair Oaks, it's just around the corner, and it's right adjacent to the Friendship Baptist Church. But this was the first commissioned commercial building that by an African-American for occupancy by African-Americans. So the inside, as you can see, there's a barber, there was an attorney's office, there were several other professional offices, and there was a lunch counter. And it was commissioned by James T. Phillips Sr., who was an attorney and real estate broker. And this is the interior of his office. And this is around, it was completed in 1923. As with the rest of Pasadena and Los Angeles, the entire community was thriving at that time. So many of the extraordinary buildings in our city were built in the 1920s. 1927 is City Hall, and then the library, the Civic Auditorium, they're all date from that same time period. So the Francisca building is extremely important because of its connection to the African-American community. This is the lunch counter inside of the Francisca building. And as we can see, it served the neighborhood. It was a neighborhood centered and focused place where folks could just walk down the street and grab something to eat. Also in this neighborhood was First AME Church. So we're going to talk a little bit about, and I'm not sure if Alma Stokes is on the call yet. She might be arriving any second now.
Let me see.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask Alma to unmute.
Great.
I'm trying to, and okay, now I'm here.
Yay.
Okay, you want to hear about the First AME Church?
Yes, perfect timing. Let me just say it was on Vernon Avenue, and Vernon Avenue was in the 710 freeway stub right now. So it's in between St. John and Pasadena Avenue, and it was bulldozed by the freeway. So Alma, go ahead. Can you talk about First AME?
It was on Vernon and Kensington. And it was a place that was big enough that we had lots of conferences and everything inside. The interior, the wood was beautiful. And you see that window there, that window, and then on the side there are some stained glass windows. And they're in the church up on Penn Street now. And there were lots of professional people there at the church. It was the center of everything, and people knew about it all over the nation as a real top AME church. And the freeway moved it out, and there was a Reverend Brown, and Reverend Brown was one of those that helped work on this church and bring it together. And then he left and started another church here in Pasadena that was on Orange Grove, and that was Brown Memorial, named after him. His son actually was a musician with Duke Ellington. Anyway, and so this church was, the people that sang in the choir were very professional people all over. And we had a pipe organ. We were one of the few churches in Pasadena that had a pipe organ. And so everything was molded around the churches. And from it, I'll go to St. Barnabas. St. Barnabas was a small church. Or do you want to, okay, there's St. Barnabas. Now, St. Barnabas was put there by the people of All Saints Church. And they did this because they did not want the Black people that worked for them and other Black people to go to All Saints. So they set up, and it was a mission for years until about 76, around in that time, in the late 70s, it became a rectory. And we had a rector at that time. And so, but all the people that went to St. Barnabas were very big professional women, people, and they were well established, and you didn't go to St. Barnabas if you were not big shot. That was the way it was. Now that was not the same for AME, but for St. Barnabas at the mission part. And so basically that is what I need to tell you about St. Barnabas. But I want to talk to you, shall I do that, Brian? Talk about, it was King's Village. Now it's King's Manor, I believe. You want me to talk about that now?
Yeah, one quick question, Alma. When was it that there was a shift? When could you start going from St. Barnabas? When could you end up going to All Saints? When did that happen?
I would guess around the 60s, the later 60s, around that time, because then things had changed and, you know, all over. And then the minister that was at All Saints, he was a fighter, and he really helped people. So he made them feel welcome. Regina Moses was one of the main people that went there because her husband had been one of the rectors at St. Barnabas. And so she didn't want to stay there after they divorced. And so she ended up she really was one of the main people for years and years at All Saints. Very quiet, but doing and well known. And she was a top principal at San Rafael, Willard, all over Pasadena. And her father was first cousins to Carter G. Woodson, who was the Negro. He was the Negro person of history that was well known all over. And the Negro National Anthem was started in where she lived in El Centro, because her father he had schools he had regular schools for his children, a high school, and they had elementary to 8th grade. He was the principal at one, and any of the Black people came back here from Howard and schools like that could not teach in Pasadena. So they would go down to El Centro and they did their student teaching. And so when they got the Negro National Anthem, it was sent down to Regina's father and mother. They were the Paynes, and they tried out the Negro National Anthem. Then the NAACP took it over as our national anthem. And it's a beautiful piece of music. Okay.
Absolutely. All right. So let's talk about let's talk a little bit about King's Villages. Is that okay?
Okay. Yes.
Because you're all dressed up, and I know you have somewhere to go.
Yes. Anyway, King's Villages is now King's Manor, But before that came into being, there was the Pepper Project, and they kept the city from making these changes in redevelopment for quite a while. It was a man by the name of Emmett Mickle that stayed on the city and gave them a fit. But then they were able to get the Kings Village started and brought in redevelopment. And I was a location specialist at the redevelopment, and I was a redevelopment specialist. I moved people from their houses to other places around in Pasadena because they had to move and they had to sell their houses. And these houses were two-story, beautiful houses. The wood, the fireplaces were the ceramics surrounding the fireplaces, the chandeliers, all that was there in those houses. And those people that lived there even had a credit union. And so we had a model of these villages that were to be built, and they were going to charge $18,000 for them. And they knew then that white people were not going to live there. But actually, redevelopment was Negro removal, period. And my supervisors, one was Bob Newworth, the other was Albie Higginbottom. You know, he's with the schools.
Right.
And anyway, they're.
Hey, Alma, you just went on mute. So while she's coming back on, oh, there you go.
Am I on?
Yes.
I don't see me, but anyway, I'll just continue to talk.
Good.
And if you want to ask me any questions, if I left something out about the King's Villages, when they moved these, like I said, they moved these people, and a lot of them did not want to leave, but they had to leave. And the city paid our salaries. And so I went back to teaching. I could not stay there. And then there was St. Barnabas started one unit, one big thing of housing. And now it's where you see all those separate little nice homes that they sold later. They tore it down after about 5 years. Because they didn't intend to have it. They just wanted to get the people out of there.
Right. So what I'm showing on the screen, Alma, is a map, and the map is of Pasadena. So for everyone who's looking, again, the upper horizontal yellow line is Orange Grove Boulevard. The next large street is Mountain. The next street above that is Hammond. I know it's hard to read because of the font size. The one right above that is Claremont. So where Fair Oaks is, and Fair Oaks is the street just to the right of all those dots. In North Pasadena, there's a huge number of dots. And that is where those families were living and were eventually moved so that the Pepper Project could be developed. And so Alma, your story is really a helpful one and a powerful one to say that there were families who were living there, but they were moved out for a development project that wasn't necessarily intended to benefit them. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes. It was just to get them moved out of there, and that's why they brought in redevelopment. Otherwise, they would have never allowed redevelopment in Pasadena, but it was to move them because they had quite a little community. The only thing left is Jackie Robinson's house in that area.
And is that on Claremont?
No, well, I'm not sure.
Or on Pepper?
It's Pepper, and it's probably Pepper, but
Yeah.
there's not too much left there. There was a couple of houses that people would not sell, and they didn't like it, but they couldn't do anything about it, and the people knew how to fight. The others let it go.
Great. So I know you have another event that you need to go to, but before you leave, is there anything that you wanted to say about the your work as a teacher in the Pasadena Unified School District, because we're going to touch on it later in the.
Oh, yes. When I first started teaching, I raised my children, and then I went back to school to get my degree. I was almost finished, and then I married. Well, and I started teaching in '63. Well, when I went to get the job, the only place I could go was Washington Elementary, because you could teach at Jackson. You could teach, no, not Jackson at that time, Lincoln, Washington Elementary, and let me see, there was, and at one time there was the one on Garfield, that where the stores and things are now, Vaughn's Market. That was the school, that was Garfield, and some could go to Garfield. And so I taught 3rd grade there, and oh, Madison was the other one. And you knew that you couldn't go anywhere else. And the same Regina Moses that I talked about, there was a principal by the name of Mr. Simmons, and he was at Don Benito, and he had her come out there with him. People were not happy, but after a while they saw she was so fantastic and had such a background that they understood. And during that time, before the judges made them integrate, Dr. Pitts had set up where he had get people get letters together, and then he brought them into the board and told them that this would be the chance for them to see what integration is all about. So there were these children that we had to provide there was Webster, Webster and Burbank and let me see, and Don Benito. I think I covered them. Anyway, if you provided your own transportation, then you could send your kids to those schools because they had empty classrooms. And so my kid, there were 4 or 5 of them, I can't remember. Anyway, I along with Helen Chris, we provided the transportation for these children. And they went out they had only experienced kids that were mentally challenged that were Black. So they thought all Black kids, and they weren't, they weren't too happy about it. And they thought all Black kids were just like the mentally challenged kids, which was not so. And so our kids, one of the girls played the violin and my daughter played the piano, and they did the school song at the end of graduation. And because it was so successful and parents were able to turn in letters again, and they opened up Marshall, and they had an actual bus that came over on, it used to come on Forest, and all those kids that were in that general area, and that was the cream of the crop. And the Williams children, my kids, Helen, Chris, there was a whole big group that filled up a whole busload that went to Marshall, and they were not treated fairly. And that you can learn about that at another time, what they went through. But I had to call up the principal and let them know some of the stuff they were doing. They had the kids meet and say, you're not going to mess up our school. And I told them, you were getting the cream of the crop. You were getting top kids. And so they learned in time. Is that enough, Brian?
Yes, that's fantastic. I don't want to take any more of your time. Thank you so much for dropping in and helping us with this.
I was glad to help. This is such a wonderful thing to do, for you to do, and share what people have gone through that we just worked around here in Pasadena. It's been going on a long time. So, okay, take care, everyone.
Brian? Ms. Stokes, Brian?
Yeah, Josh?
I have some comments for Ms. Stokes in the chat if she has some time.
I'll take a minute. What happened?
Okay. One is from Daryl Quall, who says, thanks, Ms. Stokes, for teaching so many of us, your students. And
yeah, I have them all over Pasadena. They're my kids. They're my children. And another woman, Janet Donnelly, we used to take kids all over Southern California. We had a science club, And then later on, when they went to middle school, we would take them from Elliott, and we would take them to Disneyland. A lot of them had never been out of Pasadena. They hadn't even been on the east side of Pasadena. And Diane Moore was another one, and she ended up in the Philippines teaching Wycliffe. And Diane, we used to take kids all over, so we even took them to Death Valley and gave them all kinds of experiences. And we charged them. You always have to charge like 25 cents to be a part of it, but you still charge. And we had parents that helped in, and it was integrated somewhat, because it was very limited integration at that time. And we had junior counselors from Washington Junior High. Mr. Perez, the principal, let those kids come and be a part of the trip, where they helped with the younger kids. We had 4th grade, 5th, and 6th grades from there, and we had the science club. And so and with Janet Donnelly, we just took kids everywhere to, like Mac Robinson's kids were some of those that I had in school. And we wanted to give them experiences. Nobody ever bothered her car. Nobody ever bothered mine. They knew that those cars were for them. I had vans, and she had a van. And she ended up the head of the John Muir athletic department, and was a science teacher at Muir. But she was a fantastic person.
So Josh, any other comments?
Yeah, Brian. Ms. Stokes, there's Michelle Bailey, and she asks, can you talk about why the Kings Manor was built? It was because of the 210 freeway our family lost our home. The city took our property by eminent domain. When they rerouted the freeway, they built the Kings Manor in place of the houses that had been demolished.
That's right. And that was the idea. And see, the freeway came later. Let me see. Anyhow, when the freeway came, they took out all these churches, like AME. They took out the Metropolitan Baptist Church, which is up there by the cemetery. And that was a gorgeous church. It was beautiful and huge. And Reverend Malone was he was a dynamic minister. And all the churches used to come together, and we would share. Like if there was Women's Day or Men's Day, our choirs would go and join with their choirs and made their day big. The Black community was well knitted together at one time, and it was beautiful until everything was messed up.
Exactly. That's the whole point. That's why we're here. Anything else, Josh, before Alma has to go?
Yeah, I have one last comment from Mindy Kate, who says, "Thank you, Ms. Stokes. I really appreciate hearing about this part of the history of Pasadena."
Well, anytime, I'm glad to tell you. There's a whole lot I can tell you. And what I can't tell you, my kids can tell you. 4 of them. Experiences here in Pasadena with police and everything else. I have gone down to the police department and talked to the chief of police because of something that happened with my son. So anyway.
Well, Alma, we're going to do this again. I don't know when, but we'll do this again. So we'll have you back on. Is that okay?
All right. See you all. Take care. And I'm glad to hear that about all my kids. Ask them all over Pasadena. They're mine. Okay. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Alma.
You're welcome.
Well, that was special. We were able to have Alma here. Just a couple of things to catch up real quick. This is what is remaining of the African-American community in the old Pasadena area. So this is on Dayton and DeLacy, and it's Friendship Baptist Church. And when we did the bus tour, we were able to go inside. It's a beautiful church, highly recommended if you haven't been there. I know some of you on the call are actually even members there. So I think it's just a fantastic place. And it is an anchor of the African-American community. And when I spoke to Pastor Smith last, when I was in the church, he was saying, you know, it's so interesting. I look out the window and I see all of the new townhomes and condos, and people just have no idea what they're living on top of. heritage, the history, the challenges, but also the successes. And this is a great example of that that was completed in 1925. Footnote is that Friendship was started in Pasadena in 1893 with some of the earlier African-American settlers, and then first AME was 1892. This is a quick story I need to tell that's very, very important. And it's the James Woods Mortuary, which was on Vernon Avenue as well. And so it is also buried underneath the 710 freeway stub. We will talk about the impact of freeways in a few minutes. But this is a fantastic story. So James Woods came to Pasadena. He ended up working as a shoe shine guy in one of the stores on Green Street, right near DeLacy. As he was there, he was actually asked to help out at one of the local mortuaries. He had one of those light bulb moments that we all hope for. And what he ended up doing was he said, you know what? Nobody wants to bury Black people, and Black people don't want white people to bury them, or vice versa. White people don't want Black people to bury them. So he said, I have an idea for a business. He ended up going in the 20s. So this is like 1922, 23, 24. He actually went to mortuary school. He learned everything about everything from burials and autopsies and all the other aspects of the profession. And so he was able to, just a few blocks from the Francisca building and just down the street from First AME Church and around the corner from Friendship, he opened the James Woods Mortuary. It stayed there for many, many, many years, and then ultimately moved up the street up onto Fair Oaks, where we saw on the map where the concentration of African-American families was up on Fair Oaks above Washington Boulevard. It is still there today. This is James' nephew, Fred Valentine, took over the business in the 50s, and now his family, Gail Valentine, is still running the business. This is a very, very, very important African-American business in Pasadena. It still exists, and here is an image of it right now. So if you've driven up Fair Oaks just past La Pintoresca Park on the left-hand side as you're going northward toward Altadena, you can see this building. There's actually a tree in the front of it now. So if you drive by too fast, you might miss it. But it is an extraordinary place. On the bus tour, we went inside, we toured the facility. It is a beautiful chapel, and then a visiting room, which was really, really fascinating, and talked to Gail about her family's business. So next quiz question. And again, this is for spiritual enlightenment and not for the trip to San Diego. But what was the year that the Pasadena branch of the NAACP, when was that founded? So throw that in the chat. I will wait just a second before we go to the next one. I'm sure there are folks on the call who are aware of that. And a quick story before I switch the slides, because it'll give you the answer. The W.E.B. Du Bois, who founded the, any other guesses? No other guesses? When was it founded? I'm sure Michelle got it.
There's no guesses right now, Brian.
No guesses? Okay, there's one. There's got to be one.
Michelle Bailey says, and Mindy Kate says 1919.
Great, and Mindy got it right too. So the seeds of discontent, we're gonna start with a project that the Pasadena branch of the NAACP worked on for years and years and years. And so it is 1919, W.E.B. Du Bois came to Pasadena in 1910. He met with local leaders and he said, you know, this would be a perfect location for a branch of the NAACP. His staff continued to stay in touch with some of the people. You're going to meet one of them in a minute. And then ultimately, about 9 years later, they founded a branch. One of the reasons was in 1914, this is what the Brookside Plunge looked like. in the 20s. It was developed in 1914. There was a donation of a local investment banker so that there could be a municipal pool in the Arroyo Seco. But right from the very beginning, people of color were not allowed to utilize the pool. This is a seminal civil rights issue in the city of Pasadena, and one that, of course, a lot of us and people on the call know about, but there are many, many, many folks in Pasadena that just see the Rose Bowl Aquatic Center, and they see it's a beautiful pool complex, and it's diverse people who go in there. And then the Pasadena Unified School District is teaching lessons to all the third graders throughout the district. So everything is fine, right? No, it's not. From the very beginning, people of color were not allowed. And what the city eventually ended up doing was calling it International Day to allow people of color, because there was such an uproar by the NAACP, they created International Day. International Day was Wednesdays from 2 to 5 p.m. and all non-white minorities were allowed to use the pool. The reason for Wednesdays was because that was the day that the pool was drained at the end of the day and cleaned, so that then the next day, the white pool goers would have clean, fresh water. The NAACP fought this for 28 years, and then finally in 1947, it reached the state Supreme Court, and the practice was ended by the state Supreme Court in the city. But for 28 years, there was a battle going on. And what I want people to be thinking about as far as social change, sometimes it happens quickly. Sometimes there's a catalyst that creates a huge amount of movement, but sometimes it's just determination and focus that helps us to change the context in which we live. John Wright, the man on the right of this photograph, was one of the co-founders. He came to Pasadena in 1911 from Kansas. He was a mail carrier. He, for over 50 years, he served as a board member on the Pasadena branch of the NAACP. And because of his leadership, he was one of the people who helped to force the city of Pasadena to desegregate the Brookside Plunge. One last thought before we leave the NAACP is that it is a vibrant organization. It is a very, very important organization in the city with over 100 years of service. Last night, for example, they convened, or the NAACP Pasadena branch convened a mayoral forum between the candidates Victor Gordo and Terry Tornick. And it was dedicated toward millennial voters. So most of the people on the call, there were some teenagers, but 20-somethings and 30-somethings, and they were able to ask questions of the candidates, which does not happen very often. This is an organization that has provided our city with guidance, direction, enlightenment, and fought for social justice for many, many years. I would highly recommend that you investigate more and find out how you can be supportive of them. We're going to talk about a couple things real quick, and then we'll open it up to questions. But we have a couple more topics, and the first one is housing. Federal Housing Administration created a program called the Risk Rating System in 1934. Essentially what it said is that Black neighborhoods were too risky to provide loans. What that ended up doing is it created this whole system, or this whole notion of redlining. One of the other outcomes is that if you were a realtor, you could actually lose your license if you sold a house to a Black family in a white neighborhood. What ended up happening was this exacerbated this separatism, or this segregation that was an extension of Jim Crow in the North. It encouraged white families to buy homes, but not people of color. So there were systems in place to access mortgages that made it very, very difficult for people of color to apply for those mortgages, to be accepted for those mortgages, because they were considered to be too risky to pay back the loans. One of the outcomes of this which is extremely important to today, is that the #1 generator of family wealth, not individual wealth, but family wealth, is home ownership. Next question is, what is the approximate percentage of people in Pasadena who are renters? Feel free to populate the chat with that. As you're thinking about that, today, this historic system of being disenfranchised or unable to buy your own home, currently, and this was a statistic from just a week ago, average Black households have 1/10 the family wealth of average white households. 1/10. The stat that I saw was something like average white households have family wealth of $170,000, and Black households at $17,000. So if people of color are prohibited, or maybe not prohibited, that's too excessive, prevented from buying homes, then it generationally, it makes it more and more difficult for them to pull themselves up into the middle class and then financially or economically be even more successful. The next aspect of this, the Federal Housing Administration in this process in the 30s also recommended that freeway construction would be used to separate Black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods, to isolate people of color from white neighborhoods. This was a specific focus of the Federal Housing Administration. And the quote is that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. And that's directly from the FHA in the 1930s. That's a quote from the FHA. And I want to point out that Vernon Avenue is buried now under Vernon Avenue, the center, the hub of the African-American community in Pasadena for so many years, is underneath tons and tons of concrete. What I'd like to do now briefly is to bring in Danny Parker. Danny, are you ready to talk a little bit about redlining and your family's experience with that? And Josh will look to unmute you.
Hi, Danny. If you could enable your microphone.
So as Danny is doing that, Josh, can you tell me what were some of the guesses of the percentage of Pasadenans who are renters?
Sure. I've got Mindy Pfeiffer, who said 75%, which is what I guessed. Renee Larios is 80%. Betty said 65%. And Michelle Bailey said 49.9%.
So what's really interesting about those answers is that there's a perception that there are a lot of renters in our community. And the fact of the matter, it is true. It is slightly over, and I think Michelle was the closest. So if I had, you know, the gift card to, you know, who knows, Bed Bath & Beyond, something like that, she would win it, because it is just over 50% of people in Pasadena are renters. It's a little bit higher in Los Angeles, but not a whole lot. So we have a very similar sort of system or scenario. I think the big question for everyone to ask is, what does it mean if over half of the people in your community do not own property? What are the implications of a vast or a majority of people who do not have the strongest mechanism to create family wealth if they do not have access to that? And then the subsequent question is, how might we increase homeownership in our community so that more people can own homes instead of having more renters? So Danny, are you ready to come on now, or is he having?
So I think we're having some issues with that. Danny says he's calling in, but I'm not seeing his phone.
So Josh, why don't we move on a little bit, and then if Danny can get through, just let me know, and then we can patch him in. And so we're kind of revisiting this whole notion of.
Oh, sorry, Brian. You know what? I could try doing this in just a moment. I'll call him and put him on speakerphone
Okay.
so you can hear. All right.
Well, it's this whole notion of, again, segregation and intentional segregation. And the reason why I bring up some of the national context for it, the FHA, the National Board of Realtors, those sorts of systems, is because they were instituted here in Pasadena. And one of the reasons why Danny's story is so important is because they experienced that sort of discriminatory practice. So let's hope that Josh can get through. Let me, as they're working on that, let me just talk a little bit about some of the statistics, and then we're gonna have one more story, and then we'll wrap up. This is population data. Oh, back to James Crimey, a sociology student at USC in 1941, created a research project on the social status of the Negro in Pasadena, California. It is a fascinating document. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. It is filled with very important information. So here is the data point for the total population and then the African American population by decade. What we see is and the parallel that we want to draw, or the observation we want to draw, is once the African American community reaches a certain point, that's when there starts to be more of a backlash. That's when there starts to be more of a recognition, oh, there are a lot of these folks here. And this next question exemplifies it. So at that moment, 1941, he conducts a survey. He has several hundred people randomly from Pasadena who fill out the survey. So the question is, what would you estimate the number of Negroes, African Americans in Pasadena's 84,000 people to be? What we see is fully 38%, almost 40% of the people feel as though there are 6,800 or more, or over 8%. The actual number is more at 4%. I'm going to toggle back real quick, and hopefully I don't lose anybody. But what we see in 1930s and 40, it's right about 4%. If you can see that number there in 1938, 39, a little bit more than 4%. However, 40% of the people, more than 40% of the people in Pasadena feel like the percentage is higher. So social problems arise when a small racial minority lives in the midst of a community occupied predominantly by another race, and have long been aroused. This has long aroused the interest of social investigators like James Crimey. The next question is, what is the effect of African Americans on residential value of the city? So what is how do African Americans in Pasadena affect the desirability of the city as a residential community? So improve it, only 0.4% said yes. Make no difference, about 22%, but close to 77%, almost 78% say that it makes it less desirable. So the importance of this study is that for a number of years there has existed in Pasadena a social situation to which local residents usually refer to as the Negro problem. So what James Crimey uncovered was what was called the Negro problem. So attitudes toward Negro neighbors. If an African-American family were to move into your neighborhood, would you A, be pleased, 0, B, accept them as neighbors, 14%, C, just ignore their presence, another 14%, D, agitate to have them removed, 40%, and then move yourself, 30%. So over 70% would take some dramatic action if an African-American family moved onto their block, into their neighborhood. This is another attitude. Would you favor regulations requiring that African-Americans live in a section of the city by themselves? This has everything to do with, again, segregation and isolation. And we see that 89% say yes. Only 5.5% would say no. This is extremely telling about our city. And again, be thinking about the notions of that we have today of an inclusion of a city that's progressive. I constantly hear that over and over again. We're a progressive city. Well, there's still work we need to do. And this is kind of the key point is, in preference regard to African Americans in schools, if it were possible and convenient, would you prefer to attend or have your children attend a school having A, many Negroes, 0, B, only a few, 26%, C, no Negroes, 58%, or D, it doesn't matter. So over almost again, 80% of the respondents would like to moderate or manage the number of African Americans who are in the same school as them. So next trivia question. And
Brian?
Yes.
Just to let you know, Danny is online now.
Great.
So, when you're ready.
Let's go to Danny, and I'll leave this up. So Danny, can you talk about your family's experience with, actually, I'll go back here. Your family's experience with moving around town in Pasadena.
Yes, and can everyone hear me? Or Brian, shake your head.
I can hear you.
And do you want me to clarify? Alma Stokes is my aunt. She's one of my mother's older sisters. If you'd like, I could quickly add a couple of things that she mentioned, or do you want me to just get into what my parents experienced?
If you have something that you can add to Alma's story briefly, that would be helpful.
Okay, one of the things she didn't mention is Fair Oaks between Orange Grove and Washington was the heart of the Black business community. And as part of the Pepper redevelopment project, those Black businesses between Mountain and Washington all had to relocate. So that further destabilized a neighborhood. And she also didn't explicitly mention, well, that those homes where those people were forced to be relocated were owner occupied. So it really destabilized the neighborhood, and it just brought down the entire area, I would politely say. And to Michelle Bailey, my buddy's comment or question, the 210 freeway was part of an overall pattern or plan by the city of Pasadena that was launched in the late 50s. And as my aunt was alluding to, it was to eliminate Blacks from Pasadena. And there were 4 major portions of it. It was the routing of the 210 and the 710 freeway. It was Parsons. It was the Orange Grove townhomes immediately north of the Pasadena Museum of History. And it was what's now known as King's Villages. And what she also alluded to is someone from our church, First AME, named Emmett Mickle. He battled the city of Pasadena for close to 10 years. The King's Villages should have opened around 1959 or 1960 if the city's grand plans had come to be. But instead, it was delayed by 8 to 10 years. And the demographics had evolved to the point that when they opened in 1968, no whites wanted to move there. And they were originally conceived, as she said, of $18,000 townhomes. They were converted to low-income housing because no whites would move in as part of the city's plan. And if you look at where the Black community in Pasadena lived in the 1950s, those 4 projects would have eliminated about 50% of the Blacks in Pasadena. And it's also worth noting, until 1955, there were virtually no Blacks in Altadena. So in terms of targeting the Black community in this area, it was strictly Pasadena, not Altadena at that time. And then to quickly go into my parents got married in 1958. And after they got married in February of 1958, they struggled and struggled to find places that would rent an apartment to them. It was extremely difficult, and they lived all over until they finally found some stable apartments next to what's now known as Manzanita or Brenner Park, which was Manzanita Park. And then in 1960, they bought a home a block east of Muir. And then in 1967, they wanted to buy another house as a family was growing. And what the realtors in Pasadena were all doing was they were steering Black families or Black would-be home buyers to West Altadena, which went from the 1960 census, Altadena was 4% Black. The 1970 census, Altadena was 27% Black, as West Altadena became mostly Black almost overnight due to a practice known as block busting, which one Black family would move on to a block, then the realtors would tell all the white families, someone Black moved in, you better leave and protect a little bit of your property values or move before your property values sink. And that's how West Altadena became heavily Black so quickly. So my parents did not appreciate being told where they had to live. My father grew up in rural Mississippi, came to Pasadena when he was 18 in 1954. And my mother and my Aunt Alma grew up in San Bernardino. My mother did not want to feel disenfranchised and live in an unincorporated community where she could not vote in municipal elections. And then just on general principle, neither of my parents appreciated being told where they could or could not live based on their race. And my father, to the day he died, used to say, at least in Mississippi, he knew where he stood with people. He came to Pasadena and there was all kinds of smiling in the face and stabbing in the back on various levels. And Brian, you alluded to the fact that Pasadena is now viewed as progressive, and I would agree. But up through the 1960s and early 70s, that title or that characterization did not apply to Pasadena. It was anything but progressive. Ultimately, Memorial Day weekend, 1968, my parents were able to buy a home in what is now known as Bungalow Heaven. One of the neighbors who lived 3 houses down, who owned a magazine subscription agency, when he found out we were moving in and we're going to be the first Blacks on that block in, again, Bungalow Heaven, he threatened that realtor that he would have her license revoked if he sold to those blanks. As it turned out, after we did move in, he loved us to death because my parents were very strict. So my brothers and I were very well behaved, and my father kept the most immaculate lawn in the neighborhood. But part of the point being that this history of Pasadena, I would say, has dramatically changed for the better, but I don't want anyone to have a distorted notion of Pasadena always or historically being progressive, because it was anything but that way back in the day. And there were various manifestations, some subtle, some not so subtle, in terms of how Blacks were treated and the difficulties my Aunt Alma, among others, encountered trying to get a job with the department store in Pasadena in 1950s was next to impossible. And she came to Pasadena in 1953. And one other thing real quick, and then Brian, you can give me the signal if I talk too much, and that ship probably has already sailed, is when you were mentioning about the migration, a lot of Black families in Pasadena are from Arkansas. And First AME in Pasadena used to have an Arkansas club because so many Blacks in Pasadena were from Arkansas. And Tyrone Hampton, among others, family traces back to Arkansas, as does Mrs. Ballantyne, who is the widow of Woods Ballantyne Mortuary. Her family is from, I never can remember the name of the city, but anyway, that's one other random tidbit. And that's it. Sorry, I talked too much and too fast.
No, that was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Thank you so much, Danny. And can you stay around for the Q&A in a few minutes?
Oh, yes. And just one other thing, as sort of a tidbit, you were talking about the busing. Well, I went, for what it's worth, I went from 1st to 4th grade to Sequoia School, which is at the end of the 710 stub. Then we moved to Bungalow Heaven. I went to Longfellow for 5th and 6th grade. And then busing for desegregation, as opposed to prior busing, began in 1970. I was bused for junior high to Wilson Junior High, and I was bused for high school to Muir. And I have a lot of observations and comments about the nuances and texture of busing and some of the implications and some of the realities during the first 6 years of busing for desegregation.
Great. Let's save those for the Q&A. All right. Thank you, Danny. Just to kind of give an overview, and this actually could be a lecture in and of itself or a conversation in and of itself, but the segregation of Pasadena schools, the desegregation plan, and one data point that I wanted to indicate right now is that in 1969, Allendale Elementary School had 354 white students and only 2 African-American, and Washington Elementary School had 28 white students and 1,060 African-American students. So as a result of the Judge Manuel Riel's order to desegregate the public school system, that there was a white flight, so which ended up having over 7,000 or around 7,000 children fled the public school system. So the next trivia question is, what is the percentage today of school-age children in the Pasadena Unified School District area that attend private, parochial, charter, or non-public schools? So go ahead and throw that in the chat. We're gonna jump to our next, this is our last story. And then I'm gonna talk a little bit about action. So Chip, I know you're on the call. If you could talk a little bit about your mom and her story, I think that would be a wonderful way to kind of tie things up today. So Josh, if you can find Chip and unmute him.
I'm unmuted.
Great. Thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for helping out with this storytelling.
Certainly. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So my mother's family moved to Los Angeles in the 1910s and was part of the early Black Los Angeles. And when my grandparents, her parents, retired, they retired to Pasadena. And driving out to Pasadena to visit her parents with my father and my two older sisters, I wasn't born yet. My parents fell in love with Pasadena. They loved the trees. The schools were better schools than in Los Angeles, and they decided to move to Pasadena. This was about 1957. Mom got a job at City Hall. At that time, the utilities department was housed in City Hall, and Mom worked in that office. My mother, because of her physiognomy, her complexion, her hair texture, my mother, if she walked into a room, you would not necessarily know that she was African American. By all appearances, she was a white woman, but she actually was not. So she had this job at City Hall. She did not wear a sandwich board that said, "I am a Negro," but she was not passing. But people did not know that she was Black necessarily. In 1958, well, let me back up. For many, many years, for the duration of the parade, there was the Rose Queen, but there was also Miss Crown City. And Miss Crown City, you know, like Glendale has a float and Arcadia has a float, and you know, different cities in San Gabriel Valley have floats in the parade. Well, Pasadena also had its own float that it entered in the parade. And so Miss Crown City was a woman who worked for the city of Pasadena, who was a city of Pasadena employee, nominated by her co-workers to represent the city of Pasadena on its float in the Rose Parade. So my mother was not a Rose Queen, she was Miss Crown City. Okay, sometimes people get that confused. And again, she did not compete for this. She came to work one morning and learned that she had been nominated by her coworkers as Miss Crown City. And that was a nice honor, right? She was invited to cut the ribbon at the new Sears and Hastings Ranch. She attended galas and luncheons and whatnot. And then the Star News, a journalist from the Star News came to my family's home to learn more about Joan Williams and her family, you know, sort of a article of interest for a local paper. And the journalist saw that my mother had a brown husband and two little brown babies. And he reported that back to, they didn't run the story. And the Tournament of Roses learned from the Star News that my mother was not white, but actually a Negro, a light-skinned Negro. And the next thing she knew, there was no money for the float. and they asked for the crown back, and that was the end of Miss Crown City. She appeared on the cover of Jet magazine. Anyway, the NAACP was very upset about it. My mother just, you know, my mother wasn't invested in being a beauty queen, and she felt it was an ugly chapter, and she just didn't want to, just kind of wanted to forget about it. And years later, someone from the Pasadena Weekly, Justin Chapman, learned about Mom's story. I don't know where he learned about it, but he learned about Mom's story, and he pretty much begged her to please open up and talk about it. And she decided, she talked to us about it, her children, and she decided that, you know, maybe it would be helpful for people to know this history. And so she opened up and she talked about it, and it wound up being a cover story for the Pasadena Weekly. That led to the community. The community was very upset about how she was treated by the Tournament of Roses and the city. And the mayor invited her to lunch to suss out, you know, tell me more about this story. I want to make sure, you know, everything's on the up and up. And the next thing we know, she was invited to ride the head float in the parade of, I believe it was 2014. And so there was a lot of publicity around this. She had interviews with Voice of America in China. You know, she was getting interviews from radio stations in Europe. It was kind of crazy. It surprised all of us that this story gained so much traction, but it did. And then on the day of the parade, you know, she was put on the head float, but the TV stations decided they didn't want to open the parade with that story, and they skipped her float entirely and went to a dance team immediately behind her float. So it was like a double snub. You know, they invited her back to the parade, but then didn't say anything about her at the parade. This is down in the lower right-hand corner is my mother's great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother. You know, sometimes people, I remember when the digital version of the Pasadena Weekly article came out, there were some very ugly comments about, she's just a Rachel Dolezal of the 50s, she's not Black. People said very ugly things about this imposter, without really understanding the history of miscegenation and the one-drop rule in the United States, that, you know, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that if you have any African ancestry, then you are 100% African. And then if someone shows up like my mother, you can't just overnight say, oh no, that doesn't count. You know, it's this hypocrisy that just is so maddening in this country. Anyway, I wanted Brian to include the picture of my great-great-grandmother, my mother's great-grandmother. So, you know, you would see that there's a continuity and a connection. So that's basically my mother's Tournament of Roses story, but I would like to piggyback on what Danny was saying earlier. When I was born, my parents wanted to move into a larger house, and they were looking, well, my mother was not working at that time. She had 3 children. And she would meet with realtors in Linda Vista and San Rafael. And, oh, Mrs. Williams, this is a lovely home for you. You and your family, a family of 5, blah, 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 blah. My mother would say, well, my husband will be available at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. Can you meet us, you know, later this afternoon? As soon as my brown-skinned father showed up, the house was no longer available. So they wound up buying a lot on North Arroyo Boulevard, and my father built a home there. And that's where I grew up. Anyway, that's pretty much our story, my mom's story. And I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Chip, great. Hang around and I'll just wrap up real quick, and then we'll do some Q&A for a couple of minutes, because we've gone a little bit later than I had anticipated. But thank you so much. That was beautiful. That was a wonderful story. Thank you.
Thank you.
So where are we today? Where do we go from here? One thing I want, if you're still on this call, this is important to you. If you lasted through, you know, almost 90 minutes worth of intense information, you are committed to making a difference. And so I wanted to give everyone some suggestions that I have, and we can go into more depth about any of these if you want during the question and answer. But I believe that it's not enough just to raise these issues, but to think about, this is a moment. This is a moment when we can actually create change. When you see the NBA starting a game where everyone is kneeling and their arms are interlocked, and there's a cello player playing the national anthem, and they all have t-shirts on that say vote, you know that something is different in our society right now. So we need to take advantage of this moment and create change. One of the greatest places for change in our city is the school system. I don't know if anybody answered the question as far as what is the percentage of school-age kids in private parochial or non-public school. It is approximately 40%. There is no, or higher than 40%, between 40 and 50. There's no city in this country practically that has percentages that high. Most cities are in the 10 to 20% realm. If you look even at La Cañada, San Marino, South Pass, Arcadia, which are very affluent communities, they don't have percentages that high. So first thing you need to know is do more research on this topic. We just gave you an overview, and I'm so grateful to Chip and Danny and Alma for helping me tell the story. So continue your education locally and nationally. I will show you all of the resources that I've used, but then there are national books. There's A New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. There are many, many, many other books on this. And the next one is Support Public Education. I can go into a lot of detail on this because I'm working in the public schools right now. The next one is Ask Courageous and Well-Framed Questions. When my family members make absurd comments, I don't attack them. I ask them a thoughtful question. Explain to me more. Why do you feel that way? Give me an example of what you mean. Can you give me a little bit more information? The next one is offer examples from your own direct experiences and observations when talking to these folks too. So I don't, again, try to convince anyone, but I will say, in my experience at Blair High School with Chip Williams, we did this and this and this, or in my experience in the schools today, I see this. That is much more powerful than demeaning, degrading, shaming, criticizing other people. And the next one is advocate for each other. Don't let it go unsaid. If you're in the situation where there's a racist comment or a racist action, say something about it, speak up. And then the other one I wanted to mention is have more dialogues like this one, or more conversations like this, or presentations. I'm happy to do this anywhere else around the city. I've done it several times now, and I'll continue to do it to educate more and more people. We're missing another 142,000 people that I haven't gotten to yet. So let's keep this going. So I just want to say thank you to Mindy and Josh and Washington Square, Dorothea Bradley, to whom this presentation is dedicated. It would not happen without her. Museum of History, Chip, Danny, Alma, Pete Cohen for his advice and information, Garfield Heights Neighborhood Association, Bungalow Heaven, and Baha'i Community of Pasadena. And I wanted to also mention that Alan Edson, from the president of the NAAC branch, and I put him as one of the resources, but here are the other ones: James Crimey, the Ethnic History document, the Pasadena Museum of History Archives, Race in America video, Fight the Good Fight if you want to learn about POSD schools, Water and Power Associates, and then KCET. This is what it looked like for Chip and me and Pete a few years ago. I think this is what we can aspire to, and we all really can get along. I want to know from you, what are you willing to do to help create a future where racial justice is a fact of life, where everyone has opportunity, and equity and diversity and inclusion are what we breathe and what we do every day, and not something that we have to dream about. So thank you very much, Mindy and Josh, and we'll open it up to a few questions.
Let's see. We have, for Daryl Qualls, he said, for Chip Williams, what is your great grandmother's maiden name? Where did she migrate from?
Am I, okay. I put the answer in the chat, but for everyone, my great grandmother, who's in the photograph, never made it to California. She was enslaved in Kentucky, and she and my great grandfather walked with the family that, well, actually the family that owned them traveled by the Gulf of Mexico by boat, but the enslaved people walked on foot from Kentucky to East Texas, Victoria, Texas. And her maiden name, her married name was Margaret Ellis, and her maiden name was Margaret Nelson. But again, she was not a Pasadena resident. She never made it to Pasadena. She died in Texas. But her children, some of her children, my great grandmother, my great aunt, did come to California, to Los Angeles.
Brian, we don't have any other questions right now in the chat.
I thought maybe I would add that, you know, when Alma Stokes was talking about Marshall opening up to African-American children, and there was a bus along Forest Avenue that took, she mentioned my sister. She said the Williams kids, that it was my sisters that were on that bus as well. Anyway, just a little connection there.
So Josh, if there are any other questions, I have one for everyone, and there are a few people I know on the call, and I don't personally, since some people are leaving, I just was wondering what you will do with this information. How will you use what you learned today? And what I would say is just let people unmute, and
Sure.
and then just make a brief statement. How will you use this information?
Sure. Also, I do have one question from Kaya Plansker. Plansker. It says, has this narrative history been documented elsewhere?
Elsewhere, as far as with other ethnic groups or in other cities, I guess I'd want to know more specificity on what elsewhere is. Maybe Kaya, do you want to ask that question?
Yeah, I was waiting to get unmuted. I think I saw your list of resources, and you know, I'm excited to dig into them a little bit more deeply myself. But as a first-time resident, or just sort of seeing how you're circulating to a bunch of different neighborhoods and neighborhood group associations, I'm wondering if there's a kind of aggregated, you know, for instance, if I go to Vroman's, there are sections that will tell me about Pasadena from different perspectives. I have yet to see this perspective represented in a single book or in a single sort of collection of these stories. So I was curious if you had talked to anybody along these conversations about trying to make a concerted effort to document all of this in one place.
Yeah, the one document that does a really, I think, a very, very good job is called the Ethnic History and Research Project. The problem with it is it was conducted in 1995, and what's terrific about it is that it segments various ethnic groups: Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, or Chinese Pasadenans, Armenian Pasadenans, et cetera, et cetera. So it is very thorough, and I'm actually holding a copy of it right now. But it would, that's where I would start. But I'm not aware of anything, say, at Vroman's that has this sort of depth to it and uncovers some stories that are really out of the public realm. So, and
Brian,
yes.
There's a bit of an oral history that is being done. Council member John Kennedy is working on that and done through the public access K-Pass channel, where they've interviewed some longtime Black residents of Pasadena, including two sisters who grew up at 41 West Claremont, and one is 99 and one is 92. I mentioned them to you yesterday. And so their oral history has been captured, and some others are being done as well. So that is something, I'm not sure how that will be made available, but that is a process that is in motion also.
Great. And Pasadena Media has captured some of the other stories in other ways too. And then I do know that Pablo Morales, who did Can We All Get Along, the film about Muir High School, that film is a good starting point. Then there's Go Public, which is Jim and Don O'Keefe, which is about the public school system, which is really great too. But Pablo is working on more specifically the story of Owen Brown and John Brown and the abolitionists who ended up in Altadena, and that'll be a really exciting film when he wraps that up as well. So yes, there are several projects that are going on that are helping. So Kaya, those are a few options for you.
I might just interject that I'm hoping to talk to Pablo and see if we can do it as a follow-up to this to show his documentary about John Muir. I'm hoping to do that.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. And anybody want to share how you're going to use this information, or how you might help create positive social change? I know it gets tiring, but it's something we all have to be committed to.
I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for sharing your stories. I moved to Pasadena in 1984, and I had no idea about a lot of this information. And I think I will try and pass it on to other people that weren't here tonight, and hopefully learn more and pass it on.
Thank you, Laurel, very much. You're exactly why we did this, so that we could inspire people, but then also educate them. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to comment on how you might use the information tonight? I see Daryl Qualls is unmuted.
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. Every time I hear this information, I was actually born in Pasadena in 1962 and was born in Fair Oaks and Tremont when that was an emergency hospital. And now it's the public health department. So my roots go deep, and I learn something every time I hear these presentations, and I love it because I can continue to share it.
Thank you,
Daryl,
Daryl.
I was born there as well.
Who said that?
This is Danny. I was born in Pasadena Community Hospital also.
Yeah, now it's the health department. Yeah, 62 for me.
I was the first person born in Pasadena in my family. I was born in Huntington, however.
All right.
1960.
All right.
In fact, I'm turning 60 next month.
Happy birthday.
Any other thoughts? And I can go into more details about what you can do if you've run out of ideas. I made a whole list before we started tonight. I can share these with you if you want. If you're looking for things to do, okay, I see one thumbs up. That's enough. All right. First thing is Measure O is coming up. So if you don't know what Measure O is, first thing you need to do is find out what it is. Second thing you need to do is figure out if you could help commit to it. So Measure O is a bond measure for the Pasadena Unified School District. It'll provide several $100 million, including 60 million for technology. One thing that's happening a lot with our community is the digital divide. The digital divide is really, really tough on a lot of families in Pasadena. So working with, Daryl and I are working on a project at Biery and PHS. And so we talk to the teachers all the time. The students have a tough time coming to class because it's online, because they don't have stable internet. They don't have, their Chromebook isn't working quite right. It doesn't have the capacity. So there's so many ways in which technology could be improved for students, and Measure O is one way to do that. So find out what Measure O is and see if you can help with it. Next one is, we all live near schools. Contact your neighborhood school, see if you can volunteer there in some way, shape, or form with the PTA. Something that's going on at Jackson is they're talking about having a name change. They're going to do a community event next Sunday to discuss the pros and cons of a name change and then what that name might be. So when we're talking about Andrew Jackson and some of what he represents as far as slavery and some of the other heinous activities of that time, the PTA of Jackson feels as though we need to represent our values in our names. And so that's another way to think about should Jackson School name be changed? If so, what would it be changed to? What would represent the community's values? The next one is Reading Partners is M5, Pasadena Unified School District schools. Reading Partners needs volunteers. I just talked to them yesterday. They need people to sit with kids who are behind grade level and read to them at least once a week, but maybe 2 times a week. So that's just 1 hour a week. And they love all sorts of, everyone from the community can do this. I'm going to try to get some high school students from PHS and Muir to do it. So volunteer with Reading Partners. The third one is PEF, Pasadena Education Foundation. They had, over the summer, they provided thousands, literally thousands of meals to community members, because when COVID hit, it was tough for families to get the food that they needed for a lot of reasons. But PEF did a great job, and they're still helping to coordinate meal service. They're also doing a senior to senior program, which is having senior adults, elder adults matched with high school students in a mutual mentoring program. So they get together once a week, they talk on Zoom, or they talk on FaceTime, or they text each other and they say, how are you doing? And they just have a conversation. So there are several dozen elders in the community who are doing that with Muir, Blair, PHS students and Marshall students. So senior to senior program is another one. What we're looking for is internships for PUSD students. So anybody who has an internship, and Kaya, thank you very much. She did one this summer and it was fantastic. We also need career development support. So virtual tours, if you have an office, like if you're a city manager somewhere and you want to talk to students and then show them virtually what you do each day, that would be great. Or if you're a former librarian, then job shadowing opportunities and guest speakers. I would also say that getting to know your neighbors is the best thing you could do, and Washington Square is a really good place to live. I wanted to move on Palm Terrace years ago, just didn't work out. Get to know what some of the social justice activities are. So there's Dina United, there is Black Lives Matter Pasadena, get to know what they're doing. There's POP, there's End Lawn, there's a whole bunch of them. There's PPEG, there's PTU, the acronym SOUP is out there. So get to know, find one, whether it's affordable housing or whether it's immigration, get to know one of them. And then Surge Altadena is, that's for white folks who want to participate in racial justice more deeply. So Surge Altadena is a good one. And then the last thing I would say on supporting Mindy and Josh is to decorate your yard and try to, you know, engage people through creative means, whether that's, you know, putting up a scarecrow who is wearing a mask, or you know, something that's really fun. So try to engage people in creative ways. So those are a few ideas I wrote down. Hopefully,
Brian, could you put those, some of the links in the chat, like the reading partners and this senior one, so that people can find those things?
yeah, it'll take me a couple minutes to do that. Maybe would it be okay, Mindy, if I emailed them to you and then you could share it with Washington Square?
Yeah, and I can.
Yeah,
put
that'd
it
be
in
fine.
next-
And send it, put on the emails of the people who registered. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Okay.
I just wanted to say really quick, my name is Mary Spellman. I'm Kaya and I are here from Leadership Pasadena, and I wanted to thank the association and Josh and Mindy for inviting us to participate, and for Brian for giving us the idea. This is the kind of thing, when you ask Brian, how are we going to take this? Leadership Pasadena is really focusing on how are we helping support and build leaders to support the future of Pasadena. And Kaya and I and the board feel very strongly we have to understand our history in order to move forward. And so we're talking about how we can incorporate what we did tonight into our new cohort that starts in January. So I just want to thank you all, the speakers and your association, for allowing us to be part of this, and look forward to the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Brian, can you guys hear me?
And just to wrap up, I'd like to thank Brian, Chip, Danny, and Alma, who's not here, so much for really informative and interesting evening, and enlightening, really. I just wanted to comment, Laurel moved here in 1984. I moved here in 1980 from Los Angeles, and I too had no idea that about most of what you said, especially in terms of how the freeway plowed over beautiful churches and people's homes. It's like horrifying, really, but it's important to know that. So thank you all.
Can you hear me? Can anyone?
Greg?
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to thank you as well. I do not live in Pasadena. I was born and raised, actually born in Huntington Memorial Hospital at the site of the grocery store. And Brian, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, everybody taking the time to do this. I continue to educate myself and learn about the privilege that I grew up in Pasadena, that in a sheltered existence I never knew existed. And I grew up going, my first year of kindergarten at Allendale School is one of the first years of integrated busing. And I went to public schools all the way through. I went to schools mentioned throughout this presentation. I went to Jackson Elementary after Allendale. I was bused there. I went to McKinley Junior High School, and then bused to Elliott Junior High School, and then ended up at Blair. And I have photographs that resemble the photographs you saw of Brian and Pete and their friends. What I didn't know was the extent to which the systems of government, of housing, of just in place that have created the injustice and the unequal playing field that I grew up under. I never knew about that. So what I'm trying to do is educate myself. And as Brian, I really like that list of things you can do. So when I have conversations about this, I'm not as measured as you, Brian. I try to be calm, but sometimes these conversations don't go so calmly. But at least I have the information to be able to speak educatedly about what has happened. And in my work, I live in San Diego now. I work quite a bit with law enforcement, and I'm trying to engage our sheriff's department about better ways of policing. And there's a long way to go, but I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to say that I said this before, I'm so very proud of my hometown, Pasadena, and the people in it that are doing the things you guys are doing. So thanks.
Thank you, Greg, for weighing in. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being here tonight. I know it was a long drive for you.
One of the blessings of Zoom, you know, there's silver linings and everything.
Right.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you,
Yeah, I
Mindy.
think that wraps it up. Again, thank you, all of the people who spoke. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mindy and Josh.
Have a good night.
Night.
Stay tuned for the next one.